Welcome to your introduction to the clinical portal of ACE. In this video, we're going to show you around the documentation software and discuss how it functions. ACE is a practice management solution. There are actually two ACE portals. Admin ACE, or Administrative ACE, is responsible for all administrative functions, including staff information, facility contracts and details, all patient information, and program alert messages, just to name a few. Clinical ACE is accessed only by clinical staff and is responsible for all patient scheduling, documentation, billing for services, and program alert messages. Admin ACE and Clinical ACE communicate with each other through a sync process. Admin ACE always requires a live internet connection for administrative staff to work. Clinical ACE does not require an internet connection for clinical users to work, which allows for point-of-service documentation in any setting. The clinical user will connect to the internet when they are ready to sync their data to Admin ACE. To give you a mental picture, imagine that the administrative portal of ACE is like an alien mothership. The mothership contains all of the information and is the home base for all of her alien pods. Communication between the clinical portal and the administrative portal of ACE happens by means of syncing. Each clinical user's device and ACE application are like individual alien pods assigned to the mothership. Each alien pod has the appropriate individual caseload and patient information loaded on board so that the clinicians are able to work in different geographic areas, clinical settings, and populations. In order for the individual alien pods to communicate and exchange information with the mothership, they must sync. Simply put, syncing is what allows all users of the ACE system to have and to see the same information, the same data. In this picture, you can see that a clinician has done an evaluation. She has grapes, but the company doesn't have the grapes because she hasn't synced her data. By the same token, if the administrative portal of ACE has new data, such as a new patient or oranges, she can't see that either. When the clinician syncs the device data with the mothership data, the only time that an internet connection is needed, everyone sees and has the same data. Clinicians should use the philosophy sync, blink, and roll. That means that clinicians should sync at least every night while their device charges, and then roll on as they do therapy the next day. If an Admin ACE user doesn't see something in ACE that is expected, such as certain documentation, it's possible that either the user has not done it or has not synced. Administrative and supervisory staff working in the ACE admin portal can open a staff record and pull a last synced or sync history report. Whether you access the ACE admin portal or the clinical portal of ACE, one thing remains true. ACE is a database. But what does that mean exactly? A database is a collection of information organized so that it can be accessed, maintained, and updated. The data in ACE is specifically related to patients, staff members, physicians, facilities, etc. Let's take a brief minute to talk about how ACE functions as a database. I want you to flash back to the days of the traditional paper phone book. In those days, a phone company would work diligently to collect data related to every single customer. Specifically, they were collecting names and phone numbers. The phone company would then input this data into their system. The phone company would then use the data that they entered into their system to create paper phone books. Those paper phone books were then delivered to individual homes and businesses. So here's the question. What happened if the phone company entered bad data into their system? Every single phone book that was created would have bad data. Even if the phone company corrects the error in their system after the fact, it still does not change the fact that the phone books that are already out in distribution are wrong. Simply put, bad data in equals bad data out. Additionally, data that is entered into a singular field of a database is replicated numerous times throughout the system. For example, if the phone company entered the incorrect phone number into their system, that same incorrect phone number would appear on the White Pages listing, the Yellow Pages advertisement, or even a coupon offer in the phone book. Within ACE, the same concept exists. Bad data in equals bad data out. For example, within ACE, a clinician will enter short-term goals on their plan of care document. What if the user misspells the patient's name in the goal writing process or uses the wrong name? Bad data in equals bad data out. The goal with the incorrect patient name will appear on the patient's plan of care document. It will also appear on the reauthorization questionnaire document, where those goals are reported to Medicaid. Beyond that, each time that a clinician desires to report on that goal via a plan of care or reauthorization questionnaire, the goal with the incorrect patient name recurs with no ability to fix it. Just like the phone book example, once the bad data is entered into the system, the phone book is also incorrect. Reviewing documentation for accuracy is an important step in any documentation system. Here's a list of the top 5 things that it's important to know about Clinical ACE. 1. ACE is a database, and you're going to hear that a lot. 2. Clinical users enter data into fields on forms. Once all of the forms are completed, ACE will print the information in a report format and then place that document into the patient's electronic medical record. Specific pieces of data that a clinical user enters into the form include standardized test scores, medical and clinical diagnoses, long and short-term goals, and clinical users also utilize checkboxes to identify the skilled interventions that will be used during therapy. It's all data entered into fields and forms. 3. Like any computer program or database, ACE is not perfect and will sometimes have hiccups. 4. ACE users are not perfect. We're all human, and humans make mistakes. And finally, number 5, and possibly most importantly, ACE follows an order of operations. Have you ever baked a cake? Would you ever pour a dry cake mix into a bowl and then add icing? Why not? Because that's not the order of operations. However, when you choose to follow the step-by-step order of operations to bake a cake, you end up with a beautiful cake, a cake that everyone wants to eat, versus a cake where you didn't follow the order of operations. ACE's order of operations is sequential documentation. For example, the user must sign an evaluation prior to writing a plan of care. The plan of care must be signed prior to writing a progress note. During an episode of care when a new evaluation or plan of care is needed, that documentation must again be completed in sequential order. When a current patient has an evaluation, let's say an annual evaluation, their next therapy service cannot be documented in ACE until the evaluation is signed. If the evaluation changes the patient's diagnosis, a new plan of care will also need to be signed prior to providing and documenting the next therapy service. Really, it's best clinical practice to complete sequential documentation, and ACE's order of operations helps the clinical user to follow best practice standards. Signing documentation in ACE is a program action. Signing the documentation applies a clinician's signature to the document for compliance purposes. But really, it does so much more. Let's talk about what it does. Signing billable documentation in ACE generates billing of CPT codes to the patient's funding source and applies money to the clinician's payroll. The program action of signing documentation also places data into tables so that the program can access that information for future purposes. When that data is needed for other purposes or reports, ACE looks to those tables to retrieve the data. For example, when a clinician signs a plan of care, the short-term goals are stored in a table so that ACE can access those goals when the user begins to write an authorization questionnaire, progress note, or the next plan of care or discharge summary. Signing documentation also places a copy in the patient's electronic medical record. ACE also counts the number of therapy sessions or visit number based upon the signed number of progress notes. For each episode of care for each patient, ACE follows the clinical workflow of evaluation, plan of care, and treatment. That cycle continues until discharge from therapy services is achieved. ACE allows the user to complete their own patient evaluation to begin the episode of care, or they may use another provider's clinical evaluation to start the clinical service delivery. Funding can influence the clinical workflow, especially if the funding is for Medicaid and Health Choice recipients. These two funding sources require prior authorization of services. When these funding sources are identified, ACE requires the user to complete the process for authorization prior to providing therapy services. Patients follow the clinical workflow by moving through different patient status types. In the clinical portal of ACE, there are 3 visible patient status types. Active patient-new is a patient referral that a therapist recently accepted as a new patient. Evaluations and plans of care from other provider evaluations are completed when a patient has this status. The therapist can and should document medical record notes as necessary. Therapy sessions should never be scheduled or provided for a patient in this status type. Once the plan of care documentation is signed and therapy is authorized, an admin ACE user or someone in the mothership will change the status to active patient, and then the patient can be seen for therapy services. Active patient is a patient that can be seen for therapy, evaluations, and plans of care as necessary, and authorization questionnaires when appropriate. ACE sends alerts to the clinical user based upon expiration dates of evaluations, plans of care, and authorizations. Inactive patient is a patient that is temporarily on hold due to funding, SLP, or family request. ACE does not send alerts for inactive patients. All appointments should be deleted from the schedule, and the therapist should write a medical record note or CDSA summaries as needed. Let's take a moment to identify the patient documentation created in the clinical portal of ACE. There are two locations where clinical users can create documentation. The first place is the ACE schedule. Evaluation and progress note documentation are created via the ACE schedule because these documents are tied to specific dates of service for the purpose of billing. All billable documentation is initiated from the ACE schedule. The second location is the patient record. Each individual patient will have an electronic file called a patient record that contains all the patient's demographic information. Non-billable documentation such as plan of care, CDSA summary, medical record note, and discharge summary are found on the documentation tab of the patient record, and we'll talk more about those later. Next, let's begin a general tour of ACE's clinical portal. This is where clinicians work in ACE and spend all of their time. The ACE system was developed to meet state and federal regulatory compliance requirements, as well as to include the clinical best practice guidelines that are important to all of us. Clinicians can rest easier knowing that following the clinical workflow of ACE ensures that they're working to the top of their clinical license and meeting important compliance benchmarks as well. ACE is an application that is loaded onto a user's device or computer. It's important that the device's date and time are accurate. ACE uses the device's internal date and time for documentation and billing reminders. It's also important that the user keeps Windows up to date to ensure that the program runs appropriately. ACE is accessed by clicking the blue star icon located on your desktop. Login for ACE requires a username and password. The username consists of the user's first initial and last name. The password is the first 4 letters of the user's last name and the last 4 digits of the user's social security number. Clinical ACE opens to the user's schedule. Navigation within the clinical portion of ACE is primarily done with the main menu buttons that appear on the top of almost every single form within the application. The clinical user has access to the last 3 months of the ACE schedule. The calendar can be viewed by a single day, week, or month view using the buttons in the upper left portion of the form. The user can move through the calendar by utilizing the Previous and Next buttons located under the selected schedule view. The user may also return to the current area of the selected view by tapping the Current button. The clinical user will most likely interface with the schedule by means of the Workweek view of Monday through Friday. However, the user may manipulate the schedule to alternate between the work week and the full week by means of the radio buttons located on the upper right portion of the schedule. The clinical user can also print a paper copy of the schedule by tapping on the printer icon button. Appointments on the ACE schedule are color-coded based upon the type of appointment in addition to the status of the documentation in the clinical workflow and sync process. A color key for appointments is located on the upper right portion of the schedule. Let's take a moment to examine this in greater detail. The color code of appointments are a visual alert to the clinical user and supervisory staff of the documentation status. Both the clinician and the supervisor can easily see what needs to be documented and what is complete based upon the color coding that is identified on the schedule. A gray appointment is a scheduled appointment where the appointment has not yet occurred. It is a future appointment. This is another compliance feature of ACE. You cannot accidentally document visits that have not yet occurred. Red appointments are undocumented, but they may have a small pencil icon, meaning that some of the documentation from the session has been started. Red means stop. This appointment needs attention. Yellow appointments are documented, but they have not yet been synced. Yellow means caution. There's still another step left. Sync your device. Blue appointments are evaluation appointments in which the documentation has been submitted for clinical review. Green appointments are documented and synced appointments. Green means keep going. You're doing a great job. Purple appointments are therapy sessions that have been documented as a missed visit. A missed visit only occurs if the patient was not seen according to the frequency and duration listed on the plan of care document. Light blue appointments are simply reminders for the user. Remember, it's important for the clinical user to go for the green. Green status means that you can keep going and that your documentation is complete and you will be paid for the services that you've delivered. At the end of each work week, your schedule should include only green, completed and synced visits, purple, missed visits, and light blue reminders. The schedule has a scrolling alert bar at the top of the screen. All scrolling alert messages have corresponding inbox messages that give the clinical user more information and direction. The patient section of ACE contains the patient records that are assigned to the clinical user. One way that the user can manipulate the list is to utilize the drop-down menu to only display certain patient status types, such as active patient-new. The user can also perform a search by starting to type the first or last name of the patient record they are looking for into the appropriate search field. ACE utilizes IntelliSense to search for the patient record as the user types and will automatically display matching results in the list below. To open a patient record, tap on the row with the patient's name and information. A patient record is divided into tabs. The patient record opens to the Documentation tab. This tab is used to create documentation that is not associated with a billable service, but is required for compliant service delivery. Services provided to the patient that generate a billable CPT code to the funding source of the patient are initiated from the patient appointment on the schedule. We'll take a closer look at this later. The General tab is a read-only tab that contains general patient information. Information on this tab may occasionally need to be changed. For instance, when a patient moves or when a new phone number is provided by the family, or if any information needs to be changed, the user may click the Report Changes button to notify the administrative portal or mothership of changes to the record so that it can be adjusted. You will also notice on the General tab that ACE utilizes the patient's date of birth to calculate their chronological age. The Authorization tab is a read-only tab that contains useful information for service delivery. The clinical user can check this tab to view current plan of care dates, the service frequency and intensity, authorization dates, the number of visits approved, and the visits used. The Evaluation tab is a read-only tab that contains the begin and end dates for the most recent discipline-specific evaluation and identifies the type of evaluation completed. ACE sends alert messages to complete annual evaluations based upon the data in this form. The Service Details tab identifies the likely or potential place of service addresses for the patient. When the device is connected to the internet, the clinical user can tap on the Google Map image and Google Maps will open with the location pinned on a map. The clinical user can also add a new service location by tapping the Add Service Location button. The current clinical diagnosis and medical diagnoses are read-only tables. Diagnoses are entered into this tab by signing an evaluation or plan of care other provider evaluation document. The current plan of care dates are also visible on this tab. The Funding Source tab is a read-only tab, and it's important in that it drives ACE's programming based upon the funding source requirements of prior authorization for services for patients with Medicaid or Health Choice funding. The Physician tab is a read-only tab that provides the clinical user with the name of the physician and contact information. The Referral and Placement tab is a read-only tab that provides the clinical user with information based upon the referral source, any deadline date for services to be started, the source of the evaluation, and the date the patient was assigned to the clinician. The Notes for Therapists section found at the bottom of this page will provide the clinical user with any specific information needed prior to contacting the family to schedule the start of services. On the Referral and Placement tab, you'll notice a place for primary therapist and secondary therapist. While both therapists can view patient information and write documentation for the patient, the primary therapist is the therapist that is primarily responsible for the treatment of the patient. The secondary therapist would be able to view EMR documentation and write documentation only when necessary. For example, if a patient is being treated by a speech-language pathology assistant, they would be assigned as the primary therapist. The SLPA would write progress notes for the patient. However, the speech-language pathologist that is supervising the SLPA would be assigned as the secondary therapist. The supervising therapist could write evaluations, plans of care, and complete authorization questionnaires for the patient when necessary. Additionally, a clinical fellow might be the primary therapist for a patient, but their supervisor would be the secondary therapist. The CF supervisor could view all documentation created for the patient of the CF as needed. The final tab of the patient record is the Electronic Medical Record, or EMR tab. This is where the clinical user will access clinical documentation that has been signed and placed in the patient's EMR. Clinical ACE provides the user with the last 13 months of clinical documentation. Please contact the Medical Records Group or a member of your administrative team to obtain clinical EMR documents that are not available on your device. On the EMR tab, the clinical user can narrow the search for a specific document type by using the drop-down box. Or the user can open the full EMR for the patient by leaving the document type field empty and clicking the search button. The EMR defaults to the ACE view to open documentation when selected. We'll talk more about that later. Moving along in our tour, you can see that we're now in the Facilities section of the ACE program. The Facilities section of ACE is where the clinical user can view details associated with the facilities that they serve. These facilities are sites, such as schools, hospitals, or a location where the facility is billed directly for the services provided. A facility record is divided into tabs. The first tab is the Services Provided tab. From this form, the clinical user can view all billing entered for the facility for the month selected. In order to document and bill additional facility services, the user will need to schedule a facility appointment. Scheduling and facility billing is reviewed in a separate tutorial. The General tab of a facility record is a read-only tab that contains facility contact information. The information on this tab may occasionally need to be changed. For instance, if there's a new supervising contact or a new phone number provided by the facility. When the clinician is made aware of those changes, simply tap the Report Changes button. This will open an inbox message to be sent to the admin group in the Admin ACE portal. The clinical user will then enter the new information to be updated in the facility record. The Reports tab of the facility record is the final tab. Any available reports may be viewed from this area of the program. Now let's move on to the next section of ACE, the sync. To complete a sync, the user needs the device to be connected to a steady and quality internet connection. This is the only time that a clinical user requires an internet connection. But what does a quality internet connection really mean? Essentially, if you have difficulty streaming a video on your internet connection and have interruptions in the quality of the video, such as the video pausing or buffering, it's likely that the quality of your internet connection is poor. Having a poor quality internet connection may cause your ACE application to experience difficulty when trying to sync. Once you have identified that you have a quality internet connection, the process of syncing is very simple. The user may simply click the Sync button. The sync is where the magic of ACE happens. ACE will alert the user that they are able to complete a sync and that they are not able to access the application while it is syncing. The user can make a choice to continue with the sync or not. Your first ACE sync will take several minutes to perform. These types of syncs are best not done using mobile data for an internet connection, since large amounts of data will be moving from the ACE mothership to the user's specific ACE alien pod. This could consume a large amount of data. The usual daily sync that a typical user will perform will only take a couple of minutes and typically does not move mass amounts of data. The user will see this form during the sync process. The form will show the progress of the sync in the form of a percentage. An initial sync typically takes 10 to 15 minutes. The typical daily sync should take 2 to 4 minutes to complete. The sync is complete when ACE returns to the user login screen. Enter the username and password and log in to an updated version of the Clinical ACE application. At this moment in time, your ACE alien pod and the ACE mothership are in sync. Moving along in our tour, you can now see that we're looking at the inbox. ACE uses an inbox messaging system to direct the user to complete specific tasks, documentation, or provide information as part of the clinical workflow. This is not the same as email. Inbox messages are also used to communicate about patient-related issues. The clinical user has access to the last 3 months of inbox messages in 3 folders: Inbox, Deleted, and Sent. To send an inbox message, the clinical user will tap the Send New Message button. This action will cause the message form to appear. Clinical users will typically send inbox messages to specific ACE Administrative Portal work groups, depending on what type of message they're sending. Within the ACE application, clinical users should generally send items to work groups versus individual users. This ensures that your message is handled in a timely manner. This will allow any user in that work group to accept the message or task from the work queue and process the task appropriately. This also allows work operations to continue regardless of administrative employee absences or leave times. Here we see a list of the ACE Administrative Portal work groups. The next section of ACE is mileage. Clinical users can choose to enter mileage in ACE for their business-related travel. They will enter the date worked, starting location, ending location, beginning odometer reading, and ending odometer reading. ACE will auto-calculate the mileage per entry and total miles at the end of the month. The clinical user can save mileage throughout the month, submit mileage, and print mileage. Mileage records will only be saved in the application for the previous 3 months. It is the clinical user's responsibility to save their mileage outside of the program if they wish to save it for tax or other purposes. The Reports section in ACE is the final section in the navigation bar. The reports available are designed to assist the clinical user in efficient, timely, and compliant clinical service delivery. ACE follows a general rule of left to right, top to bottom data entry. This form is a good example of that general rule. To run a report, the clinical user taps on the report name, enters the start and end date when applicable, and then taps the Run Report button. In this example, the clinical user is going to run the patient/document end dates report with a start date of November 1st and an end date of November 30th. The clinical user can sort the report by evaluation, plan of care, or authorization end date, and then tap the Run Report button. On the report, ACE will show the clinical user the patient name, any end dates of evaluations, plans of care, or authorizations that appear between the search dates. Remember, we search for document end date in the month of November. ACE will send alert messages to the clinical user when documents or authorization are expiring. However, this report is a good resource for clinical management. Another report that is useful to the clinical user is the Undocumented Appointments report. The user will enter a date range and tap the Run Report button. ACE will identify the appointments that were scheduled during the date range but are not documented. This allows both you and your clinical management team to be aware of any outstanding scheduled patient visit documentation. ACE is only one application loaded on a user's computer or device, and the Minimize button will minimize ACE so that the user can access other applications. When the user is finished working in ACE, they must click the Exit button to close the application. Most often, when a user is finished working in ACE, they will complete a sync in order to submit their documentation and data to the Admin ACE mothership. The sync is complete when the login screen appears. The user will tap Close if they do not wish to enter the application again. This concludes your introduction and initial tour of the Clinical ACE portal. You now understand that ACE is a database, the order of operations, the clinical workflow, patient status types, and you've been introduced to the types of documentation completed. Additionally, you have learned about ACE's schedule, patient section, facilities section, syncing, mileage, and reports. For further information, feel free to watch the video again and pause as necessary. Additionally, you may consult the written clinical ACE manual for detailed instructions and screenshots related to specific features and tasks.